About 7 months ago, I had one of the wildest encounters of my life, one that left me shaking with disbelief. To give you some context, I was recovering from stage 2 nasal cavity cancer at the time. The tumor was large but hadn't spread, so it was still operable. However, before surgery, I had to endure months of grueling chemotherapy to shrink it. As a side effect, I lost almost all my hair, scalp, eyebrows, eyelashes, you name it. I wore a wig to avoid the stares and assumptions, especially since I'm 6 feet 4 inches, pretty muscular, and aware that people might think skinhead at first glance. On this particular day, I just finished an intense chemo session at the hospital. By the time I got to the bus stop, I was utterly drained. I managed to board the only bus that could get me home, but it was packed. I could barely stand, let alone keep my balance on the jerky ride, so I asked a kind middle-aged man if I could take his seat. He was incredibly understanding and gave it up without hesitation. I settled in, grateful for a moment to rest, but my reprieve was short-lived. 2 stops later, chaos boarded the bus. In walked a woman who instantly radiated entitlement. She was a larger woman with that unmistakable, "let me speak to your manager" haircut, dragging along a timid-looking boy who seemed about 12 years old. As soon as she saw the crowded bus, her eyes darted around, scanning for a seat. Her gaze landed on me, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. She started pushing her way down the aisle, shoving past other passengers without so much as an "excuse me." When she finally reached me, she stood there towering over me with this self-righteous look and told me I needed to give up my seat for her son. Now, I've always tried to be polite, but I was utterly exhausted and not in the mood for nonsense. I told her, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I've just come from the hospital after a chemo session and I need to sit down." She waved her hand dismissively and replied, "We just came from the ER. My son broke his leg and he needs to sit more than you do." Her son, standing right there without any crutches or visible injury, immediately blushed and mumbled, "Mom, I'm fine." But she wasn't having it. She turned back to me and said, "He's in pain. You're young. You can stand. Get up." I tried to explain again, telling her that I was undergoing cancer treatment and truly needed the seat. To make my point clearer, I adjusted my wig slightly, revealing my bald head. I thought that would shut her down, but instead, it had the opposite effect. Her face twisted with rage. She accused me of lying, calling me a skinhead piece of trash and screaming about how I was just making excuses. Then, to my absolute horror, she grabbed my arm and started yanking, trying to physically pull me out of the seat. The whole bus had gone silent. Everyone was staring, but I held on tight, refusing to budge. That's when an older gentleman sitting nearby decided he'd had enough. In a voice so sharp it could have cut glass, he told her to stop and called her a dumb cow. She whipped around looking outraged and demanded to know who he thought he was. Calmly, he pointed out that I had no eyebrows and was clearly undergoing treatment. But instead of backing off, she doubled down, insisting I was faking it. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, she punched him in the face. Time seemed to freeze. The entire bus was in disbelief. Her son looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. But the older man didn't react how anyone expected. Instead, he stood up, pulled out a badge, and said, "Congratulations, lady. You just assaulted a police officer." Her face turned as white as a sheet. He told her to sit down and stay put while he called for backup. But of course, she didn't listen. She tried to push past passengers to escape, but they weren't having it. A group of them blocked her path, practically forming a human barricade. 3 stops later, a police car was waiting. As officers escorted her off the bus, her son turned to me, visibly embarrassed, and apologized for his mother's behavior. I felt bad for him. It wasn't his fault his mom was a nightmare. The older gentleman, who turned out to be a plainclothes officer, stayed back to take my statement. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and I didn't hesitate to say yes. Thankfully, he let me handle most of it over the phone later so I wouldn't have to go down to the station. In the end, she got a few months in jail and some community service. And me? I got a crazy story to tell, and the sweet satisfaction of instant karma. Oh, and here's the best part. I was declared cancer-free in November, and my hair is growing back. Today, I'm riding the same bus, no wig, and feeling like a whole new person. But every time I think back to that day, I'm reminded that people like her exist. And thankfully, so do heroes like that officer.
It's 4 a.m. and I can barely believe I'm writing this. What happened tonight was absolutely insane, and I'm still processing it. Oh, and by the way, English isn't my first language, so bear with me. So I'm 19, and I've got a 16-year-old little brother named Jake. Now, Jake is, well, a good kid, but let's just say he doesn't always think things through. Today, he was supposed to go to a friend's party, which I think was a birthday party, but honestly, I'm not sure. Anyway, long story short, Jake's friend ends up passing out from drinking too much, but that's not the crazy part. Here's where the real mess begins. Enter Karen. She's the mom of one of Jake's friends, and I'm sure you know the type. She showed up to pick up her kid around 3:30 a.m. Way past curfew, by the way. And the first thing she sees is my brother and his friends still hanging around. Big mistake. She immediately started freaking out, and from what I gathered, this is how the situation unfolded. Karen saw Jake and his friends and said something along the lines of, "What are you kids still doing here? It's so late." Jake, trying to keep things calm, greeted her and explained that they were all supposed to sleep over. Karen wasn't having it. She said that it was too late and they needed to head home. His friends tried to explain that their parents were asleep and that they couldn't just leave. But Karen wasn't budging. She then pointed out that the birthday boy was asleep and that they couldn't stay if he wasn't awake. Jake reassured her that everything was fine and they had permission to stay, but she insisted that she was the adult in the situation and they had to leave. At this point, Jake and his friends were basically forced out of the house by this entitled woman. They were all trying to figure out how to get home, and even though Jake didn't have his house keys, he wasn't too worried. He knew that our dad, being a bit of an insomniac, was probably awake, and he had his car keys, so he figured he could just drive home. But that's when Karen showed up again. As Jake was getting into his car, Karen confronted him and demanded to know what he thought he was doing. Jake tried to explain that he was just going to drive home, but Karen wasn't having it. She started accusing him and his friends of being drunk and told them that they weren't allowed to drive. Jake, who wasn't drunk at all, tried to reason with her, but she kept insisting that they couldn't drive, as she was the adult and they had to listen to her. Eventually, Jake decided it wasn't worth the argument and agreed to get a ride with one of his other friends who had also been kicked out. The conversation with his friend's aunt went exactly the same way. She accused them of being intoxicated and not being able to drive home. She kept telling them they had to listen to her because she was the adult. After all this drama, Jake finally managed to get home, but it wasn't without some complications. When he got to the front gate, which had to be opened manually since it was broken, he realized the front door was locked. He knew that our dad was probably asleep, and it was too late to expect him to wake up. He tried calling Mom, but she didn't pick up. Then he tried Dad, but no luck there either. By this point, Jake was panicking. He didn't know the landline number, his phone was dying, and he had no idea what to do. Then, in a last-ditch effort, he called me. I was still awake, which is rare for me at this hour, and I was honestly pretty confused. Jake explained that the front door was locked and that he couldn't get in. I was half asleep, so I initially misunderstood and thought he just couldn't open the gate. But Jake was clear that the problem wasn't the gate, it was the front door, and he didn't have keys. The alarm system was also on, and he needed me to disable it so he could get inside. I was half confused and half annoyed because Jake had never come home so late. I knew our usual curfew was around 2 a.m., so this situation was a bit out of the ordinary, but I still agreed to go downstairs and open the door for him, making it clear that if Mom or Dad got mad, he was on his own. When I opened the door and saw Jake's frantic face, I immediately understood how bad things had been. He explained everything that had happened with Karen, the argument, the way she treated him and his friends, and how ridiculous it all was. Honestly, I was tired of hearing about people like Karen. This kind of entitlement and interference just drives me nuts. But at least Jake made it home, and I think he learned a valuable lesson in dealing with difficult people. Now, as I'm typing this, it's already past 4 a.m., and I'm still processing everything that happened. I'm hoping I can sleep soon, but I had to share this with everyone. I'll update you all if anything else happens. But for now, I'm off to bed. Good night.